conventional wisdom used to be pay off your mortgage as soon as you can. Retire with a paid-for home. Some personal finance writers still believe that. I used to believe it too, but not anymore. No debt is as bad as too much debt. I used to be a zero debt advocate, but now I make a distinction between bad debt and better debt. Better debt is debt that you use to buy an appreciating asset. The mortgage on your home, your primary residence, is better debt. And I don't believe in paying it off or paying extra on it unless you just have so much money that you have nothing better to do with it. And here's why. If you have too much of your net worth tied up in home equity, your money isn't working hard enough. You're very sensitive to falling interest or real estate prices rather, and you're going to find it very difficult to tap your home equity if you need it. So let's start with the most obvious problem with home equity. It is that you are tying your money up in an asset that as a general rule doesn't earn enough. Now you can do a back of the napkin calculation on what's called your required rate of return using this formula. It's W plus I divided by 1 minus T, and I'll explain that. W is your withdrawal rate in retirement, and typically there you're going to use a number like 4 or 5%. I is the inflation rate, which has historically run 3.5% in this country. And you're going to divide those by 1 minus your marginal tax bracket. So an example of the math would be something like this. If you used a withdrawal rate of 5% and you assume 3.5% as the historical rate of inflation in this country, then you've got 5 plus 3.5% or 8. Then you divide that by 1 minus your marginal tax rate. So let's assume your marginal tax rate is 33%. So you've got 8.5 divided by 1 minus 0.33 or 0.66. 8.5% divided by 0.66 equals 12.88% required rate of return. That's the important part, okay? That is the amount of money that your money must earn over long periods of time in order to pay yourself, pay Uncle Sam, and not lose purchasing power. Now, why am I telling you that? Well, because the problem in locking up a large portion of your net worth in non-cash flow producing real estate, like your home, is that most residential real estate doesn't appreciate at anything close to low double digits over long periods of time. Maybe it does in a bubble if you happen to live on one of the coasts, maybe, but not over long periods of time. If you're like most people, the equity in your home is a big piece of your total net worth, and you need every penny of that net worth to contribute in the low double digits if you're like most people to be able to reach your financial goals. You know, most people have been brought up believing that a paid-for home is security, that they can't kick you out of a paid-for home. That's how the thinking goes. But let me just tell you, that safety is an illusion. It's something that we tell ourselves, but it just isn't true. Another thing that we used to tell ourselves is that, well, at least we can't lose money in a home like we can in the stock market. Well, we know that's not true either. Another critical problem with home equity is that the more you need it, the harder it is to get to. What lender, for instance, is going to give you a home equity loan when you've just lost your job? What kind of bargaining power do you have in the sale of your home if a loved one is sick and needs hugely expensive out-of-pocket medical treatment? One possible solution is to take out a home equity line of credit, otherwise known as a HELOC, and let it sit there unused in case you ever do need it. However, as we discovered during the mortgage crisis, that's not the foolproof solution that many people thought either. In 2008, lenders across the country froze home equity lines of credit, even for borrowers with absolutely perfect credit scores. Those lenders sent hundreds of thousands of letters to consumers telling them, oh, by the way, that home equity line of credit that you paid money to secure, sorry, you can't tap that any longer because, well, things are just pretty tight and we're not certain and we don't want to take that risk. Most of us think of diversification in terms of asset classes, but my point is that you also have to think in terms of diversifying liquidity. On the liquidity continuum, cash is obviously the most liquid. Businesses and limited partnerships are probably least liquid. And in between, you have this very broad range. Having an emergency fund is key. As you probably know, I believe in at least 12 months of expenses in cash on hand. Next comes cash flow. Interest, dividends, option premium, rent, and royalty payments are all forms of short-term liquidity. After that are items that can be readily bought and sold in efficient markets. This would include things like stocks, bonds, options, and futures. But from there, liquidity becomes murkier. Some investments, for example, have lockup periods in which you can't sell them or you'll pay a big penalty in order to sell them. Others, like real estate, can be easy to sell at times, but almost impossible to sell at others. The more complex the asset, likely the less liquid it will be. I think it's helpful to think about this. Most companies don't go bankrupt because they lose money. A company with investors pouring in cash can survive for a very long time without ever turning a profit. Companies only go bankrupt when they don't have sufficient liquidity to meet their daily obligations. Well, the same is true of individuals. Most individuals who file for bankruptcy have jobs and assets. It's just that their cash inflows don't properly match up to their cash outflows. When this happens, you have a liquidity problem. Your job as family CFO is to structure your assets so that no matter what happens, your cash inflows match up to your cash outflows. In other words, liquidity has to be a primary consideration, and that's the primary problem with lots of home equity. As a general rule, I like to think of liquidity as being inverse to assets. The less resources you have, the more liquid you need to be. As your assets increase, then you can afford to put more and more of them in less liquid assets. The same is true for variability of income. The more variable your income is, the more liquidity you need. For example, if you are a commissioned salesperson, a business owner, or work for a company with shaky prospects, you need more liquidity than someone who lives comfortably on like a government paycheck. Right? You get it? So here's your action item. If you haven't already, sit down and list out your assets. The free My Financial Plan web app from Snyder Advisors is an excellent way to keep track of those assets as well as your liabilities. Now, stack rank your assets from most liquid to least liquid. And then ask my favorite question. What if? Ask yourself, what if I had no income coming in for 2 months? Where would the money to pay my bills come from? What about 6 months, a year, 2 years? What if you were permanently disabled? What if you were sued or someone in your family became ill? Asking these questions forces you to examine your resources in terms of liquidity. If you don't like the answers you come up with, it might be time to restructure your assets or get going on augmenting your savings.